from a call and response tradition, so I'd like you to actually talk back to me. This is a conversation that hopefully we will have together this morning. I want to thank the committee for inviting me here. I want to recognize in particular Pastor Rogers, Dr. Jameson, thank you so much for your invitation. I want to say a special thank you to my sorors, the ladies of Alpha Kappa Alpha, who greeted me at the door. It was wonderful to see them as well. Thank you to Dr. Eric Williams, who accompanied me here. And greetings to all of you. I bring you greetings on behalf of Princeton Theological Seminary, where I direct the Center for Black Church Studies. But I am here today not in that capacity. I am here with some bad news, but I also have some good news. And so I call this a lament. A lament for the unfinished house of the American dream. I'll say that again because, you know, in church we emphasize some things. A lament for the unfinished house of the American dream.
Yes.
America is full of ghost towns. Ghost towns that are haunted by the spirit of the recession. So developers got caught up in the runaway housing boom, and they overbuilt and they oversold lots, condos, houses, leaving some neighborhoods strangely barren of these uninhabited model homes, these eerily desolate condos, these abandoned McMansions. See, these ghost towns hit places like California and Nevada and Florida. Some of these ghost towns were in places in remote locations where once promised municipal services like the water company, they just never quite got there. Others of these ghost towns were in major cities, cities where you have a profound contrast between increasing numbers of homeless and yet uninhabited brand new buildings. Because what the economic recession, and let's go ahead and call it what it was, the economic depression, brought home the bitter irony, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Millions of Americans on one hand having no place to live, nowhere to go, and yet, after this housing crisis boom, millions of empty houses. In one development in California that they had planned for 60 homes, the developers only completed 10 of those homes, but they were unable to find any buyers for them. And so they made the decision that rather than pay the fines to the city for these uninhabited houses, that they would bulldoze these shiny, brand new $300,000 homes that no one had ever lived in. This was in California, which is the state with the highest population of homeless in the country. What does it mean to live in a country that would rather bulldoze a $300,000 house than to allow a homeless family to live in it? In 2009, here in New Jersey, there was a story of a family that I want to share with you. The family planned to retire early and move from these New Jersey winters and go to Florida. They took their entire life savings, they invested it in a luxury condo in Fort Myers. And they, along with other families, put down a substantial deposit. This luxury condo in Florida was going to have it all. 2 pools, multiple game rooms, entertainment systems, fitness facilities. This family was going to finally leave the harshness of our winters, move into the luxury condo overlooking the river, marble floors, everything that they could imagine. But the economic crisis hit. Some of the buyers in this particular condo development decided to just forfeit their deposit. Some were unable to get mortgages. The developers themselves weren't able to secure funding in order to finish the building. But, you know, New Jerseyans were a strong lot, so this did not deter this family. They moved from New Jersey to Florida anyway. And at the time of this news report in 2009, they were the only family living in a luxury condominium development that was supposed to house 200 families. One family, a family of 3 people, the only family living in a place that was supposed to house 200 families, up to about 1,000 people. So the reporters interviewed them and they said, okay, this is an interesting choice, right? And they said, what does it feel like to live here? The family responded, well, you know, it's a little lonely, right? But it's not the fact that we're the only family living here. It's the fact that the developers never finished our home. The pool wasn't finished. The luxury game room wasn't finished. The fitness facilities were, they could not even afford to finish the hardwood floors. The father of this family remarked, quote, I'm not sure if an unfinished house can ever be a home. We are living in an unfinished house. In 1862, then President Lincoln signed the document we call the Emancipation Proclamation. And he writes this: by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states are and henceforth shall be free. The executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free, to abstain from all violence, and I recommend that in all cases where allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. These are the words of President Lincoln, a bold statement when he made it in 1863. Motivated, as we know historically, by not just the moral injunction to free enslaved people, but motivated by a desire to end a war that had torn asunder this nation, the deadliest and the costliest war ever fought on American soil. But I'm struck as a student of history by those who were nominally free, that it would take an additional 2 years before the passage of the 13th Amendment, which finally declared slavery to be over, and the time difference between the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and the time in which everybody found out that there was freedom. The reason we celebrate Juneteenth is June 19th, 1865, when finally federal troops reached Texas to let those folks know that they had been free for the past 2 years. They issued one other order. It was called General Order Number 3. And it said, the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes, work for their wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness. Now, what I find really interesting about these two documents, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the General Order of 1865, is that they both called on these newly freed people to do two things: be quiet and not start any trouble. But as One of our congressmen, John Lewis, reminds us, sometimes we are called to start a little bit of trouble. Neither document, Emancipation Proclamation, the General Order, nor even the 13th Amendment itself address the reality of what it means to proclaim freedom to the captives. No one addressed the moral, spiritual, financial consequences of freedom. Free to do what? Free to go where? Free to be whom? Was it merely freedom to continue to serve as an economic underclass? And not only did those documents not address that, these documents failed to address the emancipation of the slaveholders. This is an important historical point for us. We can talk about the freedom of enslaved people, but they weren't the only ones bound in a system of chattel slavery. If they had been physically freed from enslavement, what about those who had kept them captive for 300 years? Had they been freed? Had their minds been freed? Emancipation is unfinished work, because we still, as a nation, haven't figured out what freedom looks like for everybody. Where is our conversation about the material and spiritual and psychological dimensions of freedom? Because I want to suggest that without that conversation, it's very easy to find yourself bound once again. We want to talk about freedom, but we often don't want to talk about reparation.
Yes.
We want to talk about freedom, but we often don't want to talk about justice.
Right.
And so there's no mission accomplished here. There's no job well done. There's no banner that we can fly that says, we're done. The legacy of American chattel slavery, the legacy of 3/5 of a person, the legacy of this country's past is present, it's here, it's with us, it is palpable and tangible. This is what I want to suggest to you this morning. We have built a house. We have built a structure. It is the American dream, but it is unfinished. It is a structure that needs each one of us in order to complete its work. When I think about what that unfinished work is, I think about an economic infrastructure that perpetuates the worst of some on their backs, those who disproportionately bear the economic burdens of this country and yet don't get to participate in its advantages. When I think about the unfinished work, I think about the unfinished work even of desegregation and voting, where even in 2015 there would be those who would try to remove the right to vote from people depending remarkably upon where they live and the communities in which they reside. The unfinished work of justice is present before us when we think about the cradle to prison pipeline, when we think about the prison industrial complex. This is unfinished work.
Yes. Yes.
The same cauldron of this unfinished work, this unfinished house, this house that has been built but is lacking some windows, is lacking some furniture. It's lacking something to make it complete for everyone. This is the cauldron in which we have all been birthed. Now, I could give you some good news here. When I think about houses, I think about the one that I grew up in. And I'm not talking here about the physical house that I grew up in, but I'm talking about the house for me of the African American church. I am a daughter of the church, in addition to being a preacher. The church helped to raise me. So we often use the language of a church home. The African American church itself was birthed out of pain and sorrow. It is a theological movement that was born out of the quest and the desire for justice. The African American church was born on its knees as a protest. And so I think about the church that has been such a home to me, that has been a hope and a dream. It was a refuge for the sons and daughters of slaves and sharecroppers. The black church for me has been a spiritual home, a sanctuary, a place in which the music of the blues and the spirituals and gospel merged to create sacred music. Liturgies and litanies which fed people, which spoke to their hearts, which gave them dignity. The church home that I am a part of has been a house of affirmation, where people like my grandmother, who toiled all her life in someone else's kitchen, would on Sunday morning put on her best clothes and her best hat, and she would enter her church home, and there she entered a place of dignity. Under the brutal assaults of the unfinished work of this nation, many of our communities have built sanctuaries, refuge, and house of God. These places were theological challenge. These places were affirmation. These places were sites where we remembered that we were made in the image and the likeness of God. These were not just places of hope for the future, but places for hope for today and in our present. These churches, these buildings, these church homes were sites of what scholar Albert Rabbitoe calls places of sorrowful joy. Joy where we would go and recognize that we have come a way that with tears have been watered. Yes. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughter.
Yes.
These places, these churches were home. But our faith communities are also unfinished homes and unfinished houses. They are places where we still deal with theological challenges around the issue of justice. I'm reminded here from the words of, let's call him a theologian and songwriter, Luther Vandross, who says, a chair is still a chair, even when there's no one sitting there. But a chair is not a house, and a house is not a home. Many of our religious communities have been houses, but not homes. We've built edifices, we've built cathedrals, we've built synagogues, we've built sanctuaries, we've built mosques, we've built campuses, and we've built worship centers. But somewhere along the line, we have failed to build beloved community. We have built structures that house us, but we have not built places that everyone can call home. Because a home is a place of belonging. A home is not a place where someone stands and welcomes you. A home is a place where you have the key and you welcome yourself. A home is a place where your heart's cry and your longing and your sense of belonging meet, and you enter into your home and you shut the door on the cares of the world, and you take a deep sigh of relief and you say, I'm home. The American dream has not functioned like that for too many of us. The house of America has functioned as a place of nightmare. And so what can we do to recover the unfinished project that is the American dream. There's some other good news. Some of the other good news is that we have some examples from other art forms that tell us what we can do when there is unfinished work. There was a time in which sometimes a composer would begin the work of a symphony, where artists would begin the painting of a piece, and he or she would die before that work was finished. That the work was so big and so monumental that the painter or the sculptor or the musician or the composer would work on that piece of art for years and years and years and would never see that work to completion. We have some examples of some very famous composers who, on their deathbed, provided a means by which they wanted to see their unfinished work finished. Sometimes the composer would name one of his or her students and say, I want this student to come after my death and to finish this work. Sometimes the artist would nominate his or her apprentice and say, when I am unable to take the paintbrush in my hand, I want this young woman, this young man to come behind me and to finish that work. In our communities, we have an expression that we affirm theologically, which is that the one who has begun a good work in me is surely able to finish it.
Yes.
So I want you to think about this moment as an opportunity for you to participate in completing unfinished work. If you know something about the monument that has been erected to honor Dr. King in Washington, D.C., if you've been there to see it for yourself, you see that King rises out of stone and that it is actually an unfinished work of art. They sculpted his face, they sculpted his torso, they sculpted down to his legs, and then he arises out of an unfinished work of stone. What would it mean for us to take the legacy of King so seriously that what we are most called to do is to take a chisel in our hand and to finish this unfinished work? What would it mean for us as an artist, as a sculptor, as a teacher, as a preacher, as whatever you are, to take up the tools of your trade and to say, there is work yet to be done?
Yes.
I want to return you to that family I introduced you to in Florida, the New Jersey family that moved to their unfinished home, living there by themselves. The building developer said, well, nothing we can do, we're out of money. That family said, we need to make this unfinished house our home, even at our own expense. And so they went and they got paint and they got supplies and they went to Home Depot and they went to Lowe's and they finished the floors and they painted the unpainted walls and they put up the crown molding and they began to create from this unfinished product a place of longing, a place of belonging, a place of welcome. This is the legacy of King. We want to sanitize his legacy. We want to suggest that because we have sitting in our office today an African-American president, that his dream has somehow been fulfilled. And yet all around us, we do not see righteousness rolling down like a mighty stream. All around us, there are needs in our communities and in our churches and our places of worship, and that is the unfinished work that we are called to do. Genesis 37:19 and 20. Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we will say, some evil beast hath devoured him, and then we shall see what will become of his dreams. What will become of his dreams when the dreamer is dead? That is the question that we have been challenged to ask. It is not simply King. It is the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks
Yes.
and Claudette Colvin. It is the legacy of a Bayard Rustin. It is the legacy of these men and women who begun a work and then said to us, here, I'm passing the baton to you. It is up to you to take the chisel, to carve out of this rock your dream, so that one day we can say that this unfinished house is a home for all people, so that we can say, in this unfinished house, all lives matter, Black lives matter, so that we can say, in this unfinished house, everyone has made a contribution. She painted, he installed the floors, he helped to build the foundation, she hung the curtain. That is the legacy of King. We, you and I, have much work to be done. But I leave you with the good news that the God who has called us to do that work will surely ensure that we are equipped to finish it. Thank you.